Chapter 1. Starlight Ambush. The amber glow of Arcadian's engines flared against the inky blackness of space as the interstellar cruiser sliced through the void. On the bridge, Captain Zara Vance's eyes narrowed as she studied the sensor readings from her command chair. "Anything on long-range scanners, Remy?" she asked, her voice taut. The young ensign rapidly punched commands into his console. "Nothing out of the ordinary, Captain. We're still clear." Zara's jaw tightened fractionally, but she gave a curt nod. After spending over 2 decades traversing the perilous galactic byways, she knew better than to let her guard down, even for a moment. At the helm, her co-pilot and oldest friend, Ryder Madsen, glanced over with a wry smile. "Relax, Zara. We're halfway home with our payload. The hard part's over." She managed a thin smile in return. "I'll relax once we've made the jump to slipstream and this mineral hauler has Arcadian's precious cargo off our hands." Her fingers drummed against the arm of her chair. "The sooner we're rid of this volatile howl, the better I'll feel." No sooner had the words left her mouth than a shrill alarm pierced the tense silence. Remy's eyes widened as warning klaxons blared across his boards. "Multiple bogies just dropped out of stealth mode. We've got incoming." Zara cursed under her breath as the first impacts rocked the Arcadian violently. Red emergency lighting bathed the bridge in an ominous crimson glare. "Evasive maneuvers! Bring weapons online and prepare to return fire!" Through the transperistyle viewport, the telltale streaks of laser blasts pierced the darkness, converging on the Arcadian's position. Ryder's hands flew across the controls, his jaw clenched with grim determination. "Where are they coming from?" Zara demanded, as the ship banked hard to starboard, narrowly avoiding a volley of blazing turbo shots. "Just got a visual—" Remy's voice was laden with dread. "It's the Xyrion Raiders, ma'am." A lead weight seemed to settle in the pit of Zara's stomach. Every spacer worth their salt knew the dreaded reputation of those merciless marauders. "Well, they've picked the wrong cargo vessel to plunder. All hands battle stations." Around them the seasoned crew scrambled with practiced efficiency, born from countless drills and real skirmishes. Zara felt a perverse sense of pride swelling in her chest. If the Xyrians wanted a fight, by the galaxies, they'd get one. "They're boxing us in from all sides," Ryder grunted, his skilled hands working furiously to anticipate and counter the ruthless assault. "I can't keep this up forever." "Just keep us in one piece long enough for the main batteries to find their mark," Zara replied tersely. In the glow of the gunners' stations she could see her weapons crew frantically locking onto their agile attackers. The deck shuddered again as a near miss raked across the Arcadian's weakening shields. She locked eyes with Ryder, allowing the smallest of nods. They'd come too far, survived too much, to be taken out by a band of cosmic scavengers, not when their cargo was the key to an entire world's survival. Her hand tightened around the arm of her chair as shearing bolts of phased plasma lanced out from the Arcadian's forward cannons. For an endless, breathless moment, the bridge held utterly silent, except for the whir of machinery. Then, like a lance-piercing flesh, an agonized howl split the vacuum as one of the Xyrion vessels rolled in a cascade of flames, its mangled hulk spiraling into oblivion. A triumphant roar rose from the gunners as Zara allowed herself the fleetest of grins. "Well done, crew! Now let's finish these parasites off before—" "Heads up!" Remy's frantic shout cut her off as a new wave of blasts found their mark. The bridge lurched violently, sparks and acrid smoke blossoming from shattered consoles. Zara felt herself slammed from her chair. The wind knocked from her lungs as she struck the unforgiving deck hard. For a moment everything went black. Her head was ringing, and she could taste the coppery tang of blood. As her vision slowly cleared, she fought waves of nausea and forced herself to her hands and knees. All around her the bridge was a smouldering ruin of tangled wreckage and live sparking wires. She spotted Remy, slumped unmoving at his station, a jagged shard of metal protruding from his back at an unnatural angle. "Ryder!" she rasped out, her voice thick and ragged. Her eyes found his still form, half buried under a twisted mass of debris. Panic clawed at her as she pulled herself across the shattered deck towards him. Trembling fingers found his neck, relief crashing over her as she felt a thready pulse thrumming beneath his clammy skin. His eyes flickered open, clouded with pain but still defiant. "You... still with me, boss?" Zara managed the ghost of a smile, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "It'll take more than that, to put this old warhorse down." His answering laugh turned into a ragged cough that flecked his lips with crimson. Around them, the groans and screams of the wounded mingled with the endless barrage from the raiders' relentless siege. No! Forcing back the tide of despair that threatened to engulf her, Zara willed her battered body to respond. If this was to be their final stand, she'd face it head-on and make every last blood-crazed Xyrion bastard pay for it dearly. As fresh alarms wailed throughout the crippled Arcadian, Zara steadied her aim at the last flickers of the viewscreen, lining up the sight on the lead raider vessel. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as her finger tightened around the trigger. Let's send these scavengers straight to oblivion. Chapter 2. Desperate Maneuvers. Zara's finger tensed on the trigger as the Arcadian's remaining forward cannon tracked the lead Xyrion Raider vessel. She fought against the fiery pain lancing through her battered body, pouring all her focus into this make-or-break shot. At the last possible moment, the Raider's pilot must have sensed her intent. The sleek marauder ship banked hard to port, letting loose a blistering volley of turbocharged plasma in a desperate bid to throw off Zara's aim. With a terse grunt of effort, she matched the evasive maneuvers, her gunner's instincts taking over. The Arcadian's deck groaned in protest, but she held her aim locked true. Zara exhaled, squeezing the trigger smoothly. For an endless heartbeat, the bridge held utterly still except for the whir of machinery. Then, like an avenging angel, the Arcadian's last remaining torpedo streaked across the blackness, unerringly finding its mark on the raider's flank. An incandescent blast blossomed in the void, the shockwave slamming into the Arcadian with horrific force. Zara grappled for purchase as her world became a dizzying maelstrom of fire, smoke, and tortured metal. When the chaos finally subsided, she found herself sprawled mere inches from the shattered viewscreen, shards of transparent steel biting into her torn flight suit. Blood trickled from a deep gash above her eye, but she blinked it away with a grim set to her jaw. Hauling herself upright, she staggered back to the helm, blinking to clear her wavering vision. Ryder lay unmoving, face ashen, a cloud of crimson misting from his lips with each laboured breath. All around, the bridge was utterly devastated, the groans of the dying mingling with the whooping alerts from damaged systems. But out there, hanging in the endless void against a backdrop of glittering stars, only the twisted, burning wreckage of the raider ship remained. A savage smile tugged at the corners of Zara's mouth as she took in the sight. They might have been outgunned and outmatched, but the Arcadian had given as good as she'd gotten. A hard-won victory carved from the ashes of near annihilation. One by one, her stalwart crew began pulling themselves from the rubble, broken but defiant. Zara felt a surge of fierce pride for each of them, the family she'd forged during her decade's pledge to the Black. "Damage report," she rasped out to no one in particular, licking her cracked lips. The tart tang of sweat and ozone stung her nostrils as one of the junior engineers fought to restore the flickering panels. "Multiple systems offline across the board, Captain. Life support is holding, but we've lost primary propulsion and weapons." The young woman shot Zara a worried look. "And our slipstream drive took a direct hit. We're dead in the water." A lead weight settled in the pit of Zara's stomach as the full gravity of their situation hit home. One by one, escape routes and contingencies started flickering out like candles in a gale. "Then we sure as hell can't sit here like a sitting dram," she muttered, forcing her mind into tactical mode. "Get me eyes on our surroundings, Lieutenant. If there are any other raider ships out there, I want to know about it." The wizard engineering crew set to work, bypassing fried circuits and splicing into backup systems in a race to restore sensors and long-range scanning. Every minute that crawled by felt like an eternity, as the crippled Arcadian hung defenseless amid the starry expanse. Finally, grainy spatial scans flickered across the makeshift view screen. Every soul on the bridge held their breath as the computer passed the data. A hollow silence reigned, until a single emerald blip joined the crimson echoes of surrounding debris fields. "Raider vessel detected!" the crewman shouted, seconds before the rogue blip vanished in a blur of motion. "Damn! It just went to slipstream!" A ragged cheer went up from the battered crew. Against all odds, they'd driven off the Xyrians and held on to their precious cargo. Small mercies took on cosmic significance out here on the fringes. "Don't get too cozy just yet," Zara cautioned them, her eyes narrowing grimly. "That wounded raider might have fled, but you can damn well bet it's calling for reinforcements." As if on cue, the sensors shrilled again, multiple blood-red outriders winking into existence and already accelerating towards the Arcadian's crippled form. Zara felt her heart clench, her throat tightening. They'd won the battle, but at this rate the war was looking insurmountable. She turned towards the science station, fixing the young ensign with an intense look. "Get me a scan on that rogue planet in grid 01594 and find us any way in hell to get there. Fast." The audacious gleam in the woman's eye said it all. There would be no surrender, no ignoble defeat. Not for Zara Vance and her crew. If their luck had finally run out amid the stars, she'd make damn sure they went out on their own terms. No matter the cost. As the closing raider ships blinked into visual range, the Arcadian's engines gave a final groaning flare, lurching forward into the unknown. Into whatever oblivion awaited them. Chapter 3. Fading Hope. The Arcadian shuddered violently as it hurtled through the inky void, debris and micrometeorites pinging off its weakened deflector shields in a constant staccato hail. On the battered bridge, Zara fought to maintain her precarious footing as the beleaguered ship's maneuvers became increasingly erratic. "Stabilize our trajectory," she barked to the crew clustered around the makeshift engineering station. "If we don't keep it together, we're going to get torn apart out here." "Working on it," one of the technicians muttered through gritted teeth, fingers flying across the holographic controls in a race to vent plasma build-ups. "But I'll need a few minutes to reroute secondary systems and reinforce the—" A bone-jarring impact cut off her words as a massive chunk of stellar debris slammed into the Arcadian's forward shielding. Emergency klaxons began wailing in cacophonous chorus, with the damage alerts already screaming from ruptured conduits and overloaded relays. "Well, we don't have a few minutes." Zara pivoted to face the closest bulkhead display, just as the latest sensor readings flickered across the shattered screen. A trio of incoming blips swarmed the guttering edges of the readout, blazing an intercept course with all the subtlety of a supernova. The reprieve granted by their unorthodox escape vector had been agonizingly brief. The reinforcements she'd feared were already closing in for the kill. An icy fist clenched in the pit of Zara's stomach as the grim calculations reflected in the display's Danskin vectors and telemetry. Even with the Arcadians' thrusters operating at their theoretical limits, their shredded bulk simply couldn't outrun the sleek raider craft. "They're going to streak right past us before we can clear the debris field," Remy announced from his ruined console, accelerated breathing carrying the first edges of panic. All eyes turned towards Zara in that endless, agonizing moment of dread that preceded certain oblivion. But just before the gnarled jaws of hopelessness could clamp down entirely, her gaze hardened into that nimble raider ship. "Bring up whatever we have on its last known trajectory before it fled," she rasped out, her voice little more than a guttural rasp from smoke-scorched vocal cords. Remy toggled through the shrieking alerts clogging his boards, at last isolating the fragmented coordinates which flashed on the overhead screens. Anemic lines of vector tracking plotted the wounded raider's desperate escape route before being swallowed by the whirling currents of this accursed graveyard of orbiting debris. "Right there!" Zara stabbed a finger towards the flashing indicators, her eyes burning with ferocious intensity. They must have found some way through this maze. She spun towards the helm where Ryder was slumped, barely conscious after pouring every ounce of strength into the Arcadian's failing sublight engines. "Get us on that Raider's outbound vector, full ahead." "Cap!" His eyes fluttered open, confusion warring with the fires of delirium. "That course is suicide. We'll be pulverized long before I know what I'm doing." She cut him off with a curt slash of her hand, injecting every ounce of conviction into her voice. "Just keep us on that heading." Her voice softened a fraction as they locked gazes. "Trust me, Ryder." For an endless heartbeat, suspension reigned on the breeches man and Machine Alike held their collective breath. At last, he gave a terce node, the set of his jaw mirroring the captain's own warrior determination. With a protesting groan, the Arcadian's overstressed engines swung about, aligning them on the outbound trajectory blazed by the fleeing raider ship. Just in time, it seemed, as the first cluster of pursuer blips swept into visual range, swiftly closing the distance. Remy cast a panicked look towards Zara. "I don't suppose the escape plan you're working on has a convenient escape vector, ma'am, because those raiders are going to be all over us in 60 seconds. Rather than responding, Zara strode towards the smouldering bank of sensor consoles, eyes keenly studying the reams of telemetry streaming across shattered displays. All at once her eyes went wide, fingers tracing an erratic pattern of trajectory vectors as realization blossomed. Spinning on her heel, she moved towards the bank of starboard view screens, peering out upon the churning maelstrom. "There, that's our way through!" she shouted, jabbing a finger towards a tumbling vortex of asteroids and stellar debris so dense it appeared a solid mass from this distance. A deafening silence descended upon the bridge as her words sank in, underscored only by the shriek of overstressed bulkheads and the distant rumble of raider engines closing in. Zara met each pair of eyes in turn, allowing a feral grin to spread across her features. There would be no more orders, no frantic damage control measures. Only the arcing waters of oblivion into which they must hurl themselves bodily. And they would do so with the cold grace and untamed ferocity that had guided them across 100 worlds, or die trying. As the deadly pursuit played out in inexorable slow motion across every sensor board, the Arcadian leaned ponderously ahead under full thruster burn. Their course was set and immutable. This time there would be no more running. One way or another, their long flight among the stars would end in the crucible this lightless path had forged to receive them. The jaws of the void pulled wide as its newest disciples prepared to thunder towards their deliverance. Chapter 4. Threading the Needle. The yawning maw of the densely packed asteroid field loomed ahead, a whirling vortex of jagged debris and cutter-shredding shrapnel that spawned fresh nightmares with each collision's silent concussion. Zara felt her ship's groaning deck plates resonate with the impacts, like a doomed leviathan swimming against an apocalyptic undertow. All around the bridge, her stalwart crew watched the doomsday tableau unfold with a potent blend of awe and dread, writ large across their sweat-streaked features. Even the most veteran among them had never dared thread a gauntlet half so treacherous. But their captain's jaw was set in a grim line, her eyes gleaming with an intensity that brooked no dissent. Not when the hounds of oblivion were already snapping at their heels. "Remy, coordinate with engineering!" Zara barked out the order, her words clipped and precise, despite the rasping rasp of her abused vocal cords. "I want every scrap of power diverted to augmenting our deflector shielding and EM countermeasures." The younger officer shot her a wan look, but managed a terse nod of obedience. Both of them knew the futility of such measures against the density of derived wildfalls, threatening to scythe them to shreds. But old habits died harder than any crew when it came to spacers, running a suicide gauntlet. At the engineering console, a whipcord-lean figure fought to rebalance their faltering power grid, rerouting negligible trickles of plasma from dying secondary systems. The awesome vista of death churning before them cast an emerald pall across her sweat-slicked features as she glanced up at Zara with naked desperation. "I'm giving you everything I've got, Zara," she shouted over the klaxon wails of fresh damage alerts. "But against that kind of ablative stress, the shields won't last 30 seconds out there." For the slimmest of moments, Zara felt the black seeds of doubt blooming anew, their burrowing tendrils leeching at her ironclad determination. Was she about to lead her crew on a path that terminated in so gruesome an oblivion as that maelstrom churning before them? Had she finally misjudged the angles on an inextricable abyss? Then the crimson blips of their pursuers blinked into scathing existence upon the tactical plots. The Xyrion Raiders weren't just closing now. They were frothing for the kill, this final chase whipping their predatory frenzy into a lightless fervour of destruction. Ryder looked up from the helm, his face a mask of blood and burned composites, but the gleam in his eyes had hardened to a cold, vitreous lustre. No hesitation remained within him, only the serenity of an already dead man embracing his final, senseless run at oblivion. "It's been an honour, Zara," he murmured with gallows finality. "No regrets." A grim half-smile tugged at her lips as she gripped his shoulder with fierce camaraderie. For an endless instant their gazes locked, two warriors facing down the shrouded reaper with not a shred of fear remaining between them. Then she nodded and turned away, striding towards the centre of the madness unfolding beyond the viewports. "Brace for full ramming burn!" she bellowed, toggling open the comm circuit that threaded throughout the Arcadian's shredded superstructure. "All hands, this is your captain. We fought well and true this day, but the Black has finally called us home. I need everything you've got left in the tanks for one final push." Her eyes glittered with exhilaration and dread as the tumbling asteroid swelled to terrifying scale, eclipsing the infinite expanse of night. Serrated shards of ice as massive as city killers tumbled against planet-fracturing boulder fields, and clouds of radioactive debris thick enough to strangle a sun. And there, burning through the occluding miasma, like a newborn sun blasted from the heart of creation, was the frayed egress blazed by that solitary surviving raider ship. Their impossibly narrow window, their single untravelled road to salvation, if such an unlikely thing could even be found in this randomless wilderness of annihilation. As the overstressed Arcadian engines gamma-shifted to their most profane power-thrashing limits, Zara felt herself flung back against her brace chair, with savage G-forces unlike anything she'd ever endured. The roar of the inferno outside blasted across every frequency as the unthinkable energies catalyzed around them, forging this improbably narrow path through an asteroid field that had doubtless claimed thousands of ships in eons past. Her muscles strained against the brutal vectors, until sweating torrentially as they were smeared across space and time itself like some grotesque brush streaks of sacrificial colour blazoned across a madman's scream. No mortal vessel was meant to endure these compounded stresses, and yet the Arcadian did, its depleted shields pulsing like a guttering flame against the nightless hurricane of debris hammering them from every quarter without mercy or surcease. All around, Zara could hear the anguished screams of her crew members pushed well past their endurance thresholds to pain, the sickening crunch of bone giving way under inhuman accelerations. But still, the Arcadian's noble prow bucked and thundered, holding its narrow, screaming course through the endless blizzard of annihilation. At last, she could face the torrent of sensory horrors no more. With a silent scream of exertion wrenched from the core of her very soul, Zara surrendered to the searing whiteness crackling at the peripheries of her shattering senses, and tumbled at last into the starred brilliance of Oblivion's sweet and all cons grifter black smash. She gasped around a mouthful of oxygenated plasma before surrendering wholly to the splintering darkness that rushed up to take her. When next she awoke, it was to find herself still strapped within the seething confines of the Arcadian's command chair. Only now the avenging energies tearing at her from every angle had given way to an eerie, still serenity. Around her the bridge seemed to be holding together by sheer force of stubborn will, as did the gallant crew once more pulling themselves from shattered consoles and debris fields with grim determination etched across their faces. Ryder's visage was the first to swim into focus as he limped towards her from the helm, somehow still finding the strength to move even after that hell ride. Battered but whole, they were all impossibly, miraculously alive. We passed through," she rasped in disbelieving awe. "The corridor's ruins. They actually guided us through." Her co-pilot managed a wry, exhausted grin as he crouched beside her chair, fumbling for her restraint releases. "Screw destiny and chaos theory. We made our own luck today, Zara." Outside, hanging in silent splendor, a single azure-swirled marble of a habitable world came into view. Their trajectory had burned them through the roiling asteroid field's fury and delivered them into this star system virtually unscathed. Well, relatively speaking at least. As Ryder helped lever her to her feet, she could already see the undaunted crew triaging their latest calamity with characteristically calm aplomb. Remy and the engineers were rerouting every mote of reserve power to reinforce structural integrity and restore life support. Makeshift conduits snaked across the ravaged deck plates like articulated serpents, while auxiliary comm panels flickered into operation. This was simply another fresh hell to overcome, nothing more. Just business as usual in their ruined, everlasting star hunt. And they were still in one piece. All too briefly, Zara allowed the profound sweep of that realization to wash over her, before smothering it beneath the reassuring familiarity of their routines. "Bring the primary scanner array online." The familiar litany of commands and countercommands echoed through her aching psyche as she stalked towards the makeshift operations plot, taking shape near the remains of the view screen. One hand wiped a smear of cauterized blood from her. Chapter 5. The Sacrificial Gambit. Zara's boots struck the ravaged deck plates with crisp urgency as she stalked towards the makeshift operations plot, coalescing amid the Arcadian's smouldering ruin. All around her, the organized chaos of her crew, adapting with preternatural alacrity to their latest catastrophe, thrummed with practiced intensity. Remy stood hunched over a blazing tangle of conduits and spliced circuit panels, his slim fingers flying across an ingenic holographic interface. Without glancing up, he triggered a flurry of commands, causing a grainy starburst of data to bloom across the nearest functional screen. "I've got the primary scanners back online and recalibrated, Captain," he called out, then grimaced. Well, such as they are after that beating. A flickering topography map of the uncharted star system they'd entered resolved from the static haze. Strange, swirling eddies of hyperdense ionic interference snarled across interplanetary space, distorting the display's fidelity. But at the holosphere's center drifted a single azure-shrouded world, wreathed in vibrant cloud bands. Zara's lips peeled back in a mirthless smile as she drank in those first tenuous details of their unlikely harbinger. This was the first true sanctuary they'd stumbled upon since that fateful ambush, worlds and parsecs behind them. Perhaps their long torment was finally at an end. "Give me full spectroscopic analysis," she ordered brusquely, fingers steepling beneath her chin. "I want to know if there's any way we can regenerate the slipstream drive with native resources." It was a long shot of gargantuan improbabilities, but one they simply had to stake their very existence upon. Without the Arcadians' world-tunneling capabilities restored, they would remain hopelessly stranded on the fringes, cut off from all hope of reuniting with their long-lost home. Easy prey for the next wave of opportunistic raiders or spatial anomaly to obliterate them without trace. All eyes swiveled expectantly towards the readouts as Remy worked in feverish silence, calibrations and narrow-burst subspace pings gradually accruing a composite analysis. Zara watched with professional detachment, betraying no hint of the gnawing tension blossoming in the pit of her stomach. At last, the ensign rocked back on his heels with an exhausted sigh, dragging one hand across his face. "I've got something," he proclaimed at last, triggering a cascade of raw data that caused Zara's pulse to quicken almost imperceptibly. Definitely an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere with unmistakable biosignatures and liquid dihydrogen reserves on the surface. A few more commands, highlighted key areas of interest across the world's mottled topography. Zara felt her jaw unconsciously tightening as she leaned in closer to scrutinize the projected planetary analysis. Several heavily tectonized continental regions with the characteristic raw fractal patterning of major mineral upthrusts. Those look like viable extractive lodes of regia and Baylor trichytes. Her eyes glinted with cautious enthusiasm. Maybe even some trace heliolithics if our readings are sharp enough. An inarticulate murmur rippled across the bridge from those crewmen still standing, wavering between naked desperation and jaded skepticism. Even with ruthlessly curtailed life support siphoned to essentials, their dwindling fuel and triage supplies wouldn't last more than a few rotations. Scavenger hunts were a luxury, a hail Avalon maneuver without guaranteed outcome. But Ryder seemed to sense the shift in his captain's demeanor, a grim spectre of determination suffusing his own features as their eyes met across the ravaged ops plot. "We don't have a choice, do we?" His words came out in a ragged rasp, scoring the embers of his next statement before giving voice to it. "It's either take our chances down there or—" The implications trailed off into abyssal silence, hovering around them like a shroud, almost physical in its density. To a man, Zara saw her crew forcibly confronting a choice no living soul should ever have to make. Stay aboard an inevitability, succumb to the slow death of systemic failures cascading across their crippled ship, or brave the utterly unknown terrors of an alien world for one last, implacable gambit. She felt strangely outside herself in that moment, the persona of Zara Vance dissolving into something harder and brighter, a god-swept guiding force of purpose and resolve vectored in from dimensions outside. Her decision was made for her before words could give it form, and her mouth merely worded those alien inevitabilities. "We'll stage an emergency landing and put every able body on scavenging details. Forget about passive measures at this point. Top priority is finding any raw materials we can process into slipstream components." A profound hush descended over the bridge once more. Then the first tight nods began to ripple outward from the gathered survivors as they absorbed the finality of her proclamation. Whatever fate ultimately reserved for them down on that untamed world, they would at last be free of this interminable limbo between existences. Before anyone could raise further objections or voice protest, Zara spun towards the remains of her command console in a whirlwind of renewed vigor. A skeleton of monitoring and maneuvering interfaces flickered into lurid existence beneath her prodding commands. "Prepare for atmospheric entry and emergency deployment in 30 seconds, she announced to the bridge at large. At the makeshift helm station, Ryder wordlessly fell into sync alongside her, his steady hands already finding the controls for what little remained of their stabilizer arrays. With a bone-jarring shudder that sent warning klaxons into screaming overload, the Arcadian's prow yawed in a sickening lurch towards the orbital approach vector Zara had specified. Stabilizing their re-entry would be nigh impossible in their current configuration, so they would have to mass break through sheer friction and momentum bleed at the nightside terminator. A ragged cheer went up behind her as the ship steadied its skipping entry path, and the cratered continent swelled to terrifying scale across the view screens. Atmospheric corona already searing in blistering fans across the failing deflectors as they plunged into the world's exosphere like some metalloid leviathan breaching the final abyss. Zara's fingers danced across the jury-rigged boards, pouring every joule of reserve reactor power into the few remaining maneuvering thrusters to angle their plummeting descent. The howl of radiant heat and buffeting supersonic turbulence enveloping them reached an apocalyptic crescendo, shacking the Arcadian's buckling fuselage like a maddened berserker in the throes of its death agonies. Hull plating began sloughing away in successive layers, ripping free across successive shockwave vectors and leaving smouldering contrails of vaporized alloy in their wake. Whales of metal tearing itself apart in molecular fury drowned out all other sensation for Zara, until only the keening focus of her terminal entry burn overwhelmed everything else. At last, When the final sheared remnants of their vessel could fight the merciless descent path no longer, Zara angled the plunging wreckage into a juddering horizontal approach, overrunning the bioluminescent landscape far below. A final sonic barrier, the size of a moon's inner horizon, heralded their terminal interface with the tundra-swept plains, as layer after layer of depleted shielding collapsed in a blazing atmospheric shockwave. And then the bone-shattering deceleration impact slammed Zara full tilt into blackness without pity or prelude. Only blessed silence in the wake of such obliterating force, before the endless frigid dark claimed her completely. For how long she drifted adrift those spilted tides of oblivion, she would never know. But when her senses disintegrated at last, the first sensory impressions to greet her tortured synapses were flashes of light strobing against a horror vista of wreckage and twisted debris fields. A concussive force slammed her ruined body full against some jagged obstruction, pain detonating along every nerve trunk in agonizing peals of lightning. The bridge around her had been almost totally eradicated, a cyclonic debris tunnel rendering visibility down to mere meters at best. Zara felt herself slide sickeningly along a crumpled deck span, stained in viscera and fluids she refused to identify. Whether she still drew breath at all was an abstract consideration. The only coherent input piercing her annihilated consciousness now was the detonating impact driving her forward at immense velocity into the heart of the vortex where, and then with a final bone-crushing slam, the world ceased its tumult. Zara's flayed senses detected only the muffled silence of settling dust and gnarled wreckage before the world's last few spinning vectors finally ground to a long-overdue halt. Chapter 6. A Glimmer of Hope. An agonizing eternity seemed to pass before Zara's battered senses could fully reintegrate from the ravages of their apocalyptic descent. When at last cognizance reasserted itself, it came with a bone-deep ache thrumming through every fibre of her being. Only the whisper-faint thrum of a pulse against her throat confirmed she still clung to the last visceral threads of life. All around her, a nightmarish panorama of devastation smouldered in the ruby-tinged gloom of the Arcadian's emergency backups. Forcing battered eyelids to unstick, she blinked away the clotting haze veiling her vision to take in the full sweep of their entombment. What little remained of the bridge was now an unrecognizable mass of sheared bulkheads and compacted debris fields. Shafts of lurid crimson filtered through the compression-twisted viewports from the baleful ruddy twilight shrouding this alien world's night cycle. Her neck shallow inhalations triggered, a searing torment through her chest, doubtless from several shattered ribs and possible pulmonary trauma. A frantic, uncoordinated inventory of her body's condition confirmed at least one shattered femur and a dismaying collection of deep lacerations, concussive insults, and blunt trauma across seemingly every inch of flesh. In the stillness cloaking this grave of tangled wreckage, Zara could just make out the susurrant whisper of frigid winds keening through buckled bulkhead ruptures nearby. Strange, almost musical howls as of massive airflow systems, permeating some cyclopean latticework. And beneath it all, a cadence she realized after long disorienting moments was the slow, steady throb of this world's titanic, tectonic and atmospheric engines, reminding her that she'd survived planetfall. But survival alone did not inherently equate to hope. As her focus sharpened along with the splintered fractal awareness suffusing her battered form, she became attuned to the oppressive miasma of symbiotic potentials percolating around her meagre spark of vitality. Here in the quiescent peripheries of this endless graveyard, only the cloying weregild of annihilation's quietus awaited. Already the insidious machinations of entropy had awoken to the fresh catalyst of her dying echoes, snuffed embers, trembling towards their ultimate erasure. She could sense them massing in through every agonized inhalation, the endless, sightless demolition harrows drawn to this feast of entropic ecstasy. But even as that epiphany coalesced into jagged slivers of helixed understanding, another element warred against her capitulation to the sublime clarity of Erasia's call. Some primal synaptic spark aglow with fierce denial and defiance. A last tattered bayou shred of the soul scream laced across her very fundamental codices, screaming out from the stillness in anguished howls of self-preservation. With that lucent exhalation of self reverberating across her tormented synapses, Zara cracked open her eyes once more and began the Sisyphean ordeal of rebirthing awareness into the abattoir around her. Pain flooded back in scything waves, clawing at her senses until it receded to a dull, throbbing cadence. Movement. That was the key. To affirm her vitality in spite of the odds. With a muted grunt of effort that felt as if it rent her very bones asunder, Zara began the arduous process of manoeuvring her mangled body to some semblance of autonomy. Trying not to dwell on the macabre liquid squelches and snapping crepitants, underscoring each minuscule motion, she slowly became reacquainted with motor functions and the simple, visceral miracle of guided mobility, of forcing her shattered physiology to obey those neurons still flickering with the desperation to move, to function, to live. What felt like hours or ages later, Zara had managed to pull herself inch by ruined inch across the harrowing span of the tomb entombing her. Motility sparked fresh exsanguinations with each stitch forward, pain unlike anything her body had ever experienced. But she refused to heed those primal screams for cessation, that nihilistic solace of forfeiting consciousness and allowing the waiting, lurking silences to simply reclaim what was always theirs. In the end. At last she breached the far side of the debris field and into whatever remained of what seemed like the Arcadian's portside thoroughfare. The lurid crimson glow suggested she'd emerged into the shadow of an overhanging compression bulkhead, and whatever nameless desolation awaited beyond those shredded, outward-facing viewports. Rolling onto her back with a full-throated scream of exertion and pain, Zara found herself staring into the flickering void of emergency displays and severed cable trunks. No sign of any environmental interface remained functional, leaving her totally blind to the alien environs, just beyond their wreckage. But even robbed of those avenues into the unknown, Zara's preternatural senses sharpened with the purgence of augmented lucidity. Tastes and scents she'd never before imagined assailed her hyper-receptive chemo-arrays in a disorienting flood as barometric pressures and atmospheric currents undulated across her bare skin. There was a tangy, almost metallic pall suffusing the razor-cold tendrils caressing her sweat-slick flesh, corrupted by the lingering ion toxins of their descent. But beneath that acrid veil lay something more primordial, the thick, loamy perfume of nitrates and sulphurous compounds befurling this world's troposphere that recalled distant Bactorian techno-jungles receding into the cosmic dust of history and archaeology. Zara's nostrils flared as she drew in a deeper, disbelieving breath of the exogenous effluvia pervading this primeval alien miasma. And there it was, the unmistakable secondary Smogian traces of complex organohalide compounds, integral to any biosphere capable of producing and sustaining multicellular life. Adrenaline surged anew through her battered system, sweeping away the last lingering spectre of surrender. The data was manifest, incorruptible. They had plunged from the lightless brink of oblivion and found themselves inexplicably delivered onto shores long thought, lost to humanity's fading diaspora across the stars. A home world replete with all the basic resources needed to refurbish the Arcadian's wounded systems and slipstream drive. And beyond that, maybe even the first true foothold for her crew to begin weaving the fragmented strands of their existence into some higher transcendent purpose. If they could only endure a while longer beyond the death shrouds enfolding them now. The certainty of that revelation lent Zara an electric shock of vitality despite her grave physical ruination. She began struggling anew to rise, unknowing if she'd find any more of her people still clinging to their last flickers of life throughout this tomb, or emerge into the ghastly unknown utterly and terribly alone at journey's end. But allowing herself no surrender to such fatalistic doubts, she strained with every shard of depleted will against the jagged ferroceramic outcroppings protruding in every direction. Bones ground in their sockets with stresses no inorganic composite was designed to sustain as all of her body weight shifted perilously into vectoring herself towards the rumpled apertura studding the breach of the hull, After what seemed like an eternity slipping beneath her senses, imperative finally met endeavour, and her battered form tumbled in a semi-controlled heap out onto the gravelled expanse beyond the wreckage. A stinging chorus of razor grit pelted her abused flesh as a gout of ionized vapour went searing her nasal passages, but Zara paid such strifes no heed. All that mattered now was drinking in her first breaths of this new world's crepusculine twilight, of gazing out across an endless fractaled horizon of alien geology and xeno-architectures, awaiting her discovery in the dimly bioluminesced gloom. More welcoming and comforting than the thought of rescue or refuge, a jubilant smile slowly cracked the mask of blood and grime streaking Captain Zara Vance's face as she rose tremblingly on one elbow. This world may yet prove their deliverance, or it may swiftly become their oblivion's consecrated grave. But at long, tortuous last, their star song had scattered them across a new reckoning from which no force in the cosmos could deny them final transcendence, or utter erasure. Either cusp was hers to embrace at the final embering of life's long vigil. And for the first time in 1,000 cycles, adrift the darkness between worlds, Zara felt truly and exquisitely alive once more.